The shelter looked like it was built to fall over. That was the first thing anyone said about it. A leaning frame of scrap wood wedged behind a laundromat on the edge of Albuquerque, patched together with tarp and cardboard, sitting crooked against a chain-link fence like it had given up halfway through being built. The plywood was 3 different shades of gray, whatever wood happened to be free that week. A man walking his dog past it one morning laughed out loud. Not cruelly, just the kind of laugh you make when something looks like a joke you weren't invited to. He said, loud enough for her to hear, that the wind was going to take the whole thing down before the month was out. He didn't slow down. He didn't look twice. She didn't come out. She didn't argue. She kept nailing a strip of plywood into place because she already knew something he didn't, something none of the other people camped along that fence line knew either. Somewhere behind that crooked wall was a second room. Nobody outside that fence had any idea it existed, and what she was quietly building inside it wasn't just for her. Her name was Wren. She was 23 years old, and by the time this story ends, the same people who laughed at her shelter would be the ones lining up outside it after dark, not to mock it, but to ask if there was room for them too. This isn't a story about a girl who got lucky. It's a story about a hidden room that changed how an entire homeless camp survived its hardest winter in years, and about what happens when one person decides that surviving alone isn't the same thing as actually surviving. By the end, you'll understand what was hidden behind that wall, why it took months for anyone else to find out, and why the people who eventually saw it never laughed at that shelter again. Wren grew up in Farmington, New Mexico, a town where oil and gas work used to be steady enough that nobody worried too much about rent. Her mother worked the counter at a diner for almost 20 years. Her father was gone before she could remember him, and it was just the two of them for most of her childhood, which she says taught her early how to make very little stretch a long way. She moved to Albuquerque at 21 for a call center job that paid enough to cover a studio apartment as long as nothing went wrong. Then 2 things went wrong at once. The call center cut half its staff. 3 weeks later, her landlord sold the building to a company that doubled the rent overnight, citing renovations that never happened. She had $1,100 saved. That covered about 6 weeks, not a new lease, a deposit, and the income gap while she searched for work in a city where entry-level jobs suddenly had hundreds of applicants apiece. By week 9, she was sleeping on a friend's couch. By week 12, that friend's roommate said plainly it had to stop. Wren packed a duffel bag, a foam sleeping mat, and a tote of kitchen supplies she couldn't bring herself to throw away. And she left. She didn't tell her mother right away. When she finally did, months later from a library payphone, she said only that she'd found somewhere to stay for now. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth yet. The lot behind the laundromat had sat empty for years. Half paved, half packed dirt, boxed in by a chain-link fence with a gap where a delivery truck had clipped a post, and nobody ever fixed it. Wren found it on her 4th day of walking the city with no destination, and she did the one genuinely smart thing she'd do that entire first month. She watched it for 9 days before touching anything, tracking who came and went, when the dumpster got emptied, whether the 2 men already camped near the far corner-minded company. Nobody from the city ever came through. Felix and his nephew barely looked up when she started carrying materials in. On day 10, she started building, with almost nothing to build it from. A hand saw with a chipped blade from a pawn shop for $6. A hammer from a church donation box. Nails pulled one at a time from broken pallets behind a hardware store. Straightened flat against a curb with a rock. The frame itself came from those same pallets, board by board, carried back a little at a time, so nobody noticed someone quietly dismantling other people's shipping crates. The walls went up over 12 days, working only in the early morning before 6 and just after dark, when the lot had no witnesses. She lined the inside with flattened cardboard first, then a layer of rigid foam packing board pulled from outside a furniture store that had just replaced its floor displays. Not insulation built for a house, but insulation built from whatever the city had thrown away that week, trapping still air against the walls, so the cold had to fight through a barrier before it reached her. The roof was hardest. 2 sheets of rusting corrugated metal from a construction dumpster, the seam sealed with $11 of roofing tar, the low corner weighted with cinder blocks so wind couldn't lift it. According to HUD's most recent national count, more than 770,000 people were experiencing homelessness on a single night across the country, the highest number recorded since tracking began in 2007. Roughly 36% were unsheltered entirely, outside, in vehicles or in structures never built to house a person. Wren didn't know that number when she started building. She only knew whatever she made had to hold up entirely on its own, because there was no shelter bed open in her city the night she needed one. The front room, visible from the fence gap, took 3 weeks to finish, and it looked exactly like what the man walking his dog assumed a half-collapsed lean-to a strong wind should have already taken down. She let it look that way on purpose. A structure that looked cared for got noticed. A structure that looked abandoned got left alone. And being left alone was the entire strategy. What the front room hid was a second wall built 4 feet behind the first, flush against the laundromat's concrete foundation. The narrow gap between the 2 walls was barely wide enough to crouch through, sealed by a hinged plywood panel that swung flat and vanished into what looked, from outside, like ordinary debris. She built that hidden second room almost without meaning to. It started as storage, a place to keep tools and spare cardboard out of her small living space. But 3 months in, something happened that changed what that room actually was. A man named Desmond, sleeping in a tent 2 lots over, got caught in a flash flood that swept through a drainage channel during a night storm in late October. He lost his sleeping bag, most of his dry clothes, and the small propane stove he cooked on. He showed up at the fence gap the next morning, soaked through, asking if Wren had a dry blanket to spare. She did. 3 of them collected from a church donation drive for weeks without fully knowing why. She gave him one on the spot. Then she thought about the storage room behind her wall and about how many other people scattered along that stretch of the city were 1 flood, 1 broken zipper, 1 stolen bag away from losing everything they had left. She started stocking that room deliberately after that. Folded blankets, a box of dry socks, canned food that didn't need a stove or a can opener nobody had. A first aid kit assembled piece by piece from a hospital's expired supply donation bin 2 miles away. Nothing dramatic on its own, but enough that a genuinely bad night had somewhere quiet to go. The first real test came in January, when a woman named Priya showed up just before midnight with her 8-year-old son, both having walked nearly 2 miles after their car, which they'd been sleeping in, was towed from a lot they'd thought was safe. The boy's shoes were soaked through, and his hands had gone stiff with cold. Wren walked them through the hinged panel without hesitating, wrapped him in 2 blankets at once, and heated water over a camp stove so Priya could soak his feet until the color came back. They stayed until sunrise. Wren never told anyone else in the camp that night happened, and Priya never asked why a stranger had exactly what her son needed at exactly the right moment. Word about the room moved the way it always does in places like that, quietly, person to person, never announced. If you needed something, and you were the kind of person who wouldn't take more than you needed, Desmond or one of 2 others who knew would walk you to the fence gap after dark. The risk was obvious the whole time. More people knowing meant more chances someone mentioned it to the wrong person, or a city worker asked one question too many. That almost happened in December. A code enforcement truck rolled along the fence line one morning, the first vehicle Wren had seen enter that lot in 5 months. 2 men got out. One glanced at the crooked front wall, made a note, and said something about flagging it for spring cleanup. The younger one crouched near the seam where the plywood met the foundation, a seam just slightly too clean to be accidental, and lingered there a few seconds too long. Wren stood frozen behind the panel, breathing slow and controlled, the way she'd trained herself to after the first close call months earlier. He studied the seam a moment longer, then stood, and said it was probably old construction debris. They left 4 minutes later. She didn't move for almost 20 minutes. When she finally did, her hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. The winter that followed was the coldest Albuquerque had seen in years, with more than one night dropping into the low 20s. Nationally, that same winter, the HUD count showed homelessness rising 18% in a single year, the sharpest one-year increase on record, driven largely by rising rents and the expiration of pandemic-era rental assistance that had kept thousands of families housed the year before. Families with children were hit hardest of all, rising nearly 40% in a single 12-month period, the same category Priya and her son belonged to that January night. Wren didn't know those national numbers while she was living through that winter. She only knew what she could see with her own eyes. More people arriving along that stretch of the city every month. More people who had never expected to end up there. The hidden room kept growing through it. By February, it held enough dry clothing, food, and basic supplies to help 6 or 7 people through a genuinely bad week, without most of them ever knowing exactly where it had all come from, or that nearly every item had been carried in piece by one 23-year-old barely getting by herself. Nationally, that same year, homeless service systems only had enough capacity to move about 16% of the households currently staying in shelters into permanent housing, according to the same HUD data. For everyone else, waiting simply meant staying exactly where they already were, which is part of why one hidden room stocked with dry socks and canned food mattered as much as it did along that particular stretch of Albuquerque, where the wait for anything more permanent had no clear end in sight. A woman named Carmen, who ran a small nonprofit 2 blocks away, helping people transition into stable housing, started noticing the pattern before she ever learned Wren's name. People showing up warmer and better fed than they had any reason to be. She traced it back the way people like Carmen usually do, quietly, by asking careful questions and listening more than she talked. When Carmen finally found Wren, she didn't lead with paperwork. She said only that she'd heard someone in that lot had been taking care of people without asking for anything back, and she wanted to meet her. Wren didn't say yes right away. She'd learned to be careful about offers that sounded too easy. It took 3 more conversations and 1 more hard freeze before she agreed to fill out the first form for a transitional housing program with a unit opening that spring. She kept the shelter through the final weeks while the paperwork cleared, unwilling to give it up before the new place was certain. It was during those last weeks that Desmond finally asked to see the whole thing properly, not just the front room he'd visited a dozen times, but what was actually built behind the hidden wall. She walked him through the panel on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the shelves of folded blankets, the stacked cans, the organized first aid supplies, all of it built from nothing. All of it hidden behind a wall designed to look like garbage from the outside. He said it was the last thing he expected to find behind something that looked like it was falling apart on purpose. Wren told him that was exactly the point. Nobody protects what they already think is worthless, and nobody questions a room that looks abandoned before they even open it. What she'd actually built wasn't just a place to sleep through a winter. It was proof that a person with almost nothing left could still choose, quietly, without needing anyone to see it happen, to build something for the people around her too. The same man who had laughed outside the shelter that first week walked past again in early March. The same stretch of sidewalk, the same slow morning pace with his dog. He didn't laugh this time. Desmond happened to be near the fence gap when it happened, and he told Wren later that the man had stopped, looked at the shelter for a long moment, and said only that it was still standing before he kept walking. He never learned what was actually behind that wall. Almost nobody outside the fence line ever did, except for the small handful of people who genuinely needed to. Wren moved into her own apartment that spring, 4 blocks from the laundromat where the shelter still stands. She kept one thing from that hidden room, a small tin box Desmond had given her before she left. The same one she'd used to store dry matches through the hardest winter. The front wall still looks exactly the same today, crooked patched, exactly the kind of structure a person walks past without a second glance. Somewhere behind it, the hidden room is still there too, still stocked, now looked after by 2 people who learned everything they know about it from Wren herself. What stays with people who hear this story isn't really the shelter itself. It's the decision underneath it that someone with almost nothing chose, quietly and without asking for any credit, to make sure the next person had something too. If this story gave you something to sit with today, that's exactly why stories like this exist here. If it moved you even a little and staying around, subscribing, leaving a comment, that's what keeps us able to keep finding and telling stories like Wren's. Thank you for spending this time with her.